So these kinds of things really do present opportunities, I guess, for law enforcement, all of these things. Well, we have at least one...
Mary Lou, let me just comment on that, because one of the questions you might ask, too, is what happens to these offenders?
Yeah, and
right?
What happens to the ones that don't get arrested?
Exactly. One reason for diffusion of crime control benefits could be if you arrest a lot of people, they may be the people offending not only in that target area but also in areas surrounding, and that's probably one reason. But we found in our interviews some interesting things going on. One was in the prostitution site. Remember, we used what we thought was knowledge of crime prevention that had been developed over the last 10 years. The NIJ had produced a report, What Works, What Doesn't, What's Promising, I believe was the title. And we built on that and also some experts. And we also included community policing kinds of approaches. So when the cops went to the prostitution site, they also identified organizations nearby that worked with prostitutes, tried to help them to get out of prostitution, etc. It turned out that had some traction to it. About a third of the prostitutes, according to the ethnographer, not according to our data, a third of the prostitutes desisted and started getting involved in these sorts of groups. Now, whether they desist in the long term, I don't know. But it suggests also the salience. You might actually get a benefit. Now, another element, if you think about prostitution, not about from our study, is again, we tend to think of people as absolutely committed to doing this, and prostitutes or drug deals would seem to be pretty involved. A lot of offenders are not as committed to crime as we think. In a study, in a housing project in the UK, they cracked down at a specific place, at a prostitution market, and they found out a lot of the women did not continue offending. And they interviewed them. They found out some were housewives or people at other jobs who were doing this to make extra money. Now, I know that might sound strange, but that was in fact what was happening. So there are, on the one hand, models or opportunities for desistance, for actually stopping these people from getting involved in crime. I think it's also very important to note that a lot of people get involved in crime in a serendipitous way. If we take away that opportunity, they may not get involved. We know this with our children sometimes. We know this with ourselves. Removal of opportunities can sometimes stop us. A lot of crimes are committed without much pre-thought, on the way to something, with a group of guys, with a group of gals, etc. And if you can block the opportunities that make that crime easy or make it attractive, then you also could have a long-term impact. Now, there was one type of displacement I should note in our study, and it wasn't area displacement that we noticed as much. It was that sometimes the prostitutes or the drug dealers in this study would change the way they worked. In other words, they started working with beepers. The prostitutes started making dates. Now, in this sense, the strategy of the police did not end the crime, but they removed them from the immediate area. And at least the police chief in Jersey City said to me, if I can get people off the streets, so the streets are not, people aren't being bothered, etc., well, that's a benefit for me. And I look at that as still a crime prevention benefit.
Interesting. So you're a police chief in these economic times. They've slashed your budget. They cut your staff. And you want to use your resources efficiently, but how do you go about doing that under the current circumstances?
Look, I think efficiency is a critical issue here. Now, the truth is that my own view would be one should be careful about reducing the strength of urban police too much, because there's a point at which you can't do anything beyond answer 911 calls. A lot of what the police do is that they simply respond to citizens who call them after the fact. Now, if you want your police to do something about crime prevention, there has to be resources for that. Now, those resources may be more limited in a period of economic difficulty. But if that's the case, why wouldn't you draw on the efficiency of hotspots policing? You have, I mentioned before, that you need about a quarter as many targets to get at about the same amount of crime. Crime is stable in those areas, meaning that you're not wasting your resources on a place that just would have gotten better anywhere, what statisticians call regression to the mean. It's an approach that is very easy for the police to carry out in some sense, because it doesn't involve tracking people across the world for the most part, though that might be a part of it in some sense. The places themselves are right there, and you can go after them. So it seems to me that choosing a few hundred places in a city that are particularly crime prone is a lot more efficient strategy than trying to cover the whole entire city in some sort of blanket, which is what many police departments tried to do, the idea of omnipresence. Omnipresence is a gigantic mistake. The police do not have enough resources to be omnipresent. If you did, if you could put a police officer in every single street segment in the city, well, that might be good. You'd be wasting a lot of money, in my view. But nonetheless, it's not realistic in the present circumstances. And therefore, in my view at least, hotspots policing provides a tremendous opportunity for the police to focus in resources, to save money, if you like, to be efficient about policing, rather than to spread those resources across the urban landscape.
Well, so could you just tell us a little bit more about how law enforcement needs to change in order to implement hotspots policing?
Well, the key to this all is what I said at the very outset about the crime equation, or for police, the crime prevention or control equation. The police need to change the center of that equation, in my view. They need to focus their interest and efforts much more on places. Well, how do you do that? What would they need to do? Well, here are just some ideas. One is that police know an awful lot about the perps. They know who done it, what they look like, where they came from, sometimes their education. Some databases in police departments have all sorts of socio-demographics in these people, lots of information, their modus operandi, etc. But we know very little about the places where crime is occurring. There are places in the city with hundreds of calls, some places even perhaps with 1,000. I don't know if that occurs in D.C. Very large numbers of calls to the police. Is there a database readily accessible to police, like the databases on individual offending, that tell them, here's the history of crime at this place, here's the kind of things going on, this is where it's happening, it's in the bar, it's in the building. There are lots of kids on this street. In a study we have now, it turns out that if you have juvenile delinquents on the street, I should put that differently, you have kids that are truant in school and have all sorts of behavior problems, you're going to have more traditional crime in that street than in other streets. So you should know about the characteristics of this street. Now the truth is we don't. The only reason we know where crime occurs is because the police had to send cars somewhere and they needed the addresses. Indeed, until 10 years ago, those addresses were always, when I tried to geocode, to put in a geographic information system, data in Minneapolis in the early 1990s, we found that we could only use the program for about 20% of the addresses. We had to recode everything. Now, most police departments have improved all that. On that, they've improved. They still haven't collected that other data. Now, the other thing the police need to do is they need to change their focus a bit in terms of what crime prevention is about. They need to start thinking about where done it rather than who done it. They need to start thinking about the place. Now, that says a group of different things. If I'm concentrated on the person, then what I'm usually thinking about is identifying that person, arresting them, bringing them to justice. Now, I'm not saying that's not an important part of police work. But when you focus on the place, a new set of questions begins to emerge. What can I do to decrease the opportunities for crime at that place? Should I increase surveillance of the police? Should I work with the community so they'll increase surveillance? Should I change certain opportunities for crime in that street? Should I identify the times of day and maybe increase police presence? Should I develop problem-oriented policing at that place? It changes the framework. The question becomes, how can I make that place safer? How can I make the people at that place safer? Now, there's an added benefit if we take this approach, I want to note. The approach, person-centered prevention, has a downside to it that we all know about today, which is, in the end, we put a lot of people in prison, more than any other place in the world, more than we ever put before, many times more. We have a gigantic prison population. That cost us a fortune, $50,000 to $100,000 a year per cell. It is a gigantic social problem in a sense, the fact that we have to do something with all these people. Now, I think place-based prevention offers something different. We're still going to have prisons and jails. That's not going to go away. And there are going to be a lot of people in those places. But if we change that focus to doing something about the place, then maybe we could prevent some crime. Maybe in that case of juveniles, we can stop some of those juveniles from getting involved in the criminal justice system. So in that case, the evidence is we can get more crime prevention by focusing on places. Well, if that's true, we can get more crime prevention, and we get less people in the criminal justice system, we've got more safety, and we have less costs from prisons. It seems to me that's an experiment we ought to think about.
So you think we could actually decrease incarceration through this approach?
I think so. Let me put a caution on that. Many times when throughout the United States today, police departments know about hotspots. Many police departments throughout the U.S., I think in a Police Foundation survey a few years ago, something like half or more of the larger police agency were doing hotspots analysis. They want to identify where the hotspots are. Now the problem is if you just throw police to those hotspots and you just arrest people, then the result will probably be you'll arrest a lot of people. More than the traditional approaches? I don't know. But that suggests that when we think about hotspots policing, it has to be more than just arresting, more than just enforcement. And why not? Because there's something about opportunities at those places. Do something about it. In the case of juvenile crime, wouldn't it be nice? There's a whole series of studies on juveniles that suggest that they get into trouble when they're unsupervised socializing. So here we find we have all this crime committed at restaurants, malls, activity spaces for kids. Well, what would happen if we sent out people, not police officers even, to put some more supervision in those places? Maybe then we could have a crime prevention effect without arresting those kids and bringing them into the criminal justice system. So you can just increase arrests if you focus it on hotspots. I don't know if you can increase it beyond where we are now. But certainly there's an opportunity to arrest less, if you like, and get more public safety.
That's